In 1958, Robert Monroe lived a life defined by mid-century predictability. He was a rational broadcasting executive managing a successful corporation with offices right on Madison Avenue. He had the outward markers of American success: a wife, 2 children, a quiet home in Westchester County, and a daily commute. He also had a clean bill of health with no history of physiological or psychological illness. Then, without warning, that reality broke. While lying in bed, Monroe began floating out of his physical body. Fully conscious, he experienced a primal, terrifying sensation of falling, convinced he was in the active process of dying. On paper, he was an ordinary man moving through a corporate career. In private, he was violently fighting his way back into his physical form several times a week. When an unexplained physiological variable enters a rational mind, the illusion of control collapses. Monroe told no one about these episodes, not even his wife. Instead, he quietly subjected himself to clinical examinations, hoping medicine could isolate a biological cause. The doctors ran their tests. They found no underlying neurological conditions and no evidence of a brain tumor. They could offer nothing to explain what was happening to his body. Still searching in secret, Monroe consulted a psychiatrist and a psychologist. Both friends, they conducted evaluations and ruled out psychosis, but neither could offer a scientific explanation for the symptoms. The medical and psychological establishments of the 1950s had reached the limits of their diagnostic tools. Stranded in that vacuum, Monroe realized he would have to become his own principal investigator if he wanted to survive. Slowly, Monroe forced himself to stop fighting the separation. Over roughly a year, he pushed past the panic and deliberately logged 40 documented out-of-body trips. To analyze this growing data set, he established a private research and development division inside his own broadcasting company. His logs detailed the mechanics of what he called the second body. He recorded that this form is malleable. While it initially mirrors the physical self, it loses its humanoid shape as the subject becomes familiar with operating it. Even in this fluid state, the second body is never entirely free. Monroe noted a permanent, invisible physical tether stretching across space, anchoring the projecting form back to the biological body. Once separated, standard physical limits stop applying. Monroe reported that distance becomes irrelevant, and the speed of light is no longer a barrier to movement. By converting uncontrolled, terrifying episodes into written data points, he turned a private crisis into a repeatable protocol. Monroe began pushing the limits of this protocol. He claimed to have ventured outward to observe the surface of Mars and the cratered far side of the Moon. He recorded these lunar observations before NASA captured its images, though historically the Soviet Luna 3 probe secured the first photographs of the Moon's far side in October 1959. Inside his R&D division, the focus shifted from charting locations to questioning the mechanics of awareness, analyzing how consciousness functions in comatose patients or under heavy anesthesia. This led to a hypothesis. Consciousness operates like a magnetic field. It could remain intact and active even when the biological body's electrical current is cut. Monroe eventually cited national survey data suggesting he was far from alone, noting that over 25% of the population reports at least one variation of this anomaly. Treating consciousness as an independent variable meant the existing biological models were incomplete. Investigating it required a different framework. For over a decade, Monroe maintained corporate secrecy. That ended in 1971 when he published his compiled logs in the book Journeys Out of the Body. The publication triggered a wave of public validation. Volunteers arrived seeking to test the methods, prompting Monroe to build dedicated laboratory facilities to monitor them. The research began securing institutional recognition. Monroe presented his findings at the University of Kansas Medical Center, delivered papers to the American Psychiatric Association, and lectured at the Smithsonian. In his later work, Monroe turned away from the physical universe. He reported encountering thousands of non-physical entities operating out of phase with Earth. Moving the research from a secret corporate office into the academic spotlight demonstrated how subjective anomalies could be examined through a formal, structured lens. Monroe treated the survival of physical death as a verifiable fact of direct knowledge, accessible through his protocol rather than religious faith. The man who began his journey paralyzed by the fear that he was dying had become a pioneer in the exploration of human consciousness. The premise of his case study became straightforward. Death is an illusion generated by the restrictive limits of the biological body. Monroe argued that the greatest barrier to human growth is the fear of the unknown. He spent his career dismantling that fear by turning it into objective data.